Hello and welcome to the Queering History series. I am your host and I'll be your guide through this series where we explore what LGBTQ+ history, or queer history as historians often call it, is all about and why it is important for everyone to know and still matters today. In this video, we are discussing gay history. We will explore the history of the gay community by breaking down what the gay identity is, going over a brief timeline of how gay history has developed, and then talking about two important gay historical figures. You can also find a link to our blog on today's video and some further reading in the link in the description. Throughout the video, we will pause and do some fun activities together, so be ready for these as well. You can download a worksheet to follow along with the video and complete these activities from the activities link in the description. You can complete them by yourself or with a partner or as a class. This video is about 25 minutes long, but may take longer to watch if you decide to complete the activities. You can spend as much time on them as you need. Videos in the rest of the series will look at some examples of LGBTQ+ history in depth and explore what they can tell us about what it was like to be queer in the past and what they can show us about our society today. So stay tuned and subscribe to not miss these. If you are new to the channel or topic of LGBTQ+ history, then check out our introduction video in the link in the description for an overview of the LGBTQ+ community and queer British history. This video focuses on the gay male community, while the introduction video focuses on the history and overview of the whole community. If you enjoy what follows, please like and subscribe. You can also find our social media in the description as well. Now, let's discover some gay history. Before we get into this video properly, let's go through some definitions and information relating to the gay identity. Firstly, let's go over identity, sexuality and gender again if you have not watched our introduction video. Identity is the different parts of yourself that make you you, such as your gender and sexual orientation, culture and nationality, and religion and upbringing. Sexual orientation, or sexuality, is made up of how you experience romantic and sexual attraction and forms a part of your identity. Gender is how you feel inside in terms of whether you are a girl or boy or somewhere in between. It is expressed and performed on the outside. For example, if you feel like a girl inside, you may wear dresses on the outside to show your gender, as in our society this is how some girls express their femininity. It also makes up your identity. It is different from your sex, which is either male or female and what you were born as. Your gender may or may not be the same as your sex. Now that we understand these terms, who does the word gay refer to? If you watched our introduction video, can you remember? Or if not, can you work it out? Pause the video to see if you can create a definition of gay in your worksheet or on some paper, and resume when you are ready for the answer. Now that you've had a chance to work it out, let's see if you were right. The word gay refers to men and some non-binary people who have romantic and sexual attraction only towards other men and some non-binary people. Non-binary people are people who identify outside of the man and woman binary. They identify with a gender outside of this. To learn about non-binary people in depth, check out our transgender history video in the description. The gay community is very large and diverse, and throughout history there have been many communities and groups that have shaped the identity into how we know it today. We will go into more detail on some of these communities later on. There are also many different ways that gay people express their gender identities and sexualities. Some gay people prefer to identify and present themselves as more feminine, whilst others prefer to identify and present themselves as more masculine. Some men prefer to present themselves and identify as neither masculine or feminine, or somewhere in between. Some gay people are also gender non-conforming, so may prefer to not conform to traditional standards of how men should be and appear in society, and others may prefer to conform to these standards. The gay community, as we have said, is very diverse, and how gay people choose to identify and present themselves is very personal to each individual. As well, there are also different words that people may use to describe being gay, such as homosexual, which also refers to gay people. Except the definition of homosexual can also include women and is more old-fashioned. Gay people also have a unique place in society, as they are men, but not heterosexual men. This is because the society is heteronormative. It assumes heterosexuality to be the default in people and set standard for society. So often LGBTQ+ people are ignored or not as represented, resulting in homophobia, a hatred or prejudice against LGBTQ+ people. Remember, being heterosexual is when you experience romantic or sexual attraction only towards the opposite sex or gender. So a man who loves women and women who love men are heterosexual or straight. Our society is also patriarchal, so it is structured so that men have more power and sets a specific standard of what it means to be a man or woman. In the past, this meant that it was important for men to live up to society's standards of what being a man is in order to maintain their social power. In a heteronormative, patriarchal society like ours, the standards of what men should be were influenced by these two things, so men were expected to be heterosexual and masculine in a certain way in order to uphold their place of power in patriarchal society. So, because of these two aspects of society, gay men in the past could not conform to the standards of how it was thought that men were supposed to be, because of their sexuality, meaning that they were not heterosexual. Consequently, as they could not be heterosexual and help uphold the patriarchy, throughout history they have been considered a threat to social order and discriminated against and ignored by religions, laws, and groups of people, which we will go into more detail on soon. Let's pause before we get to the next part of the video. Now that we understand the gay identity, what kinds of issues do you think that gay people might have faced in the past? What kinds of issues might gay people face today? Pause and discuss your ideas or have a think to yourself. Write your ideas in your worksheet and resume the video when you are ready to continue. Now that you've begun to think about the types of issues that gay people have faced in the past, let's see if we can develop your ideas with this timeline. Below, you can see a general timeline that relates to gay history from ancient times to now in Europe. The timeline does not include every event and figure in the history of the gay community, but some of the key things that show how the meaning and idea of being gay developed throughout history. Before we start, it is also important to remember that much of gay history overlaps with bisexual and transgender history because they were not thought of as being separate from being gay or lesbian in the past until much later on. But we will discuss this more in our transgender and bisexual history videos in the link below. Firstly, on our timeline of gay history, in ancient Rome, men were allowed to be attracted to whoever they wished. The Romans thought of being gay in terms of social class and being dominant and submissive, which they thought equated to being masculine or feminine. So, it was tolerated for men to be gay as long as they were the dominant masculine partner and engaged in acts with someone of a lower social class like a male slave or prostitute. If a higher class Roman was the submissive feminine partner to a lower class Roman, then it would be seen as humiliating. Next, during the Middle Ages in Europe after the rise of Christianity, being gay was thought of as an act called sodomy, which is a biblical word for sex between men. In 1179, Pope Alexander III outlawed sodomy as it was a sin, making it punishable by life in a monastery for clergy or excommunication for non-clergy, which would kick people out of Catholicism. Third on our timeline, in the early modern period, laws that were made against sodomy in the Middle Ages by the Church began to be made by monarchs and governments as well. In 1533, for example, the Buggery Act outlawed sodomy and was punishable by death. However, the Renaissance period made early modern European societies familiar with ancient Greek and Roman sexualities through literature, so some historians argue that there is evidence of early modern expressions of homosexuality beyond sodomy. For example, many men engaged in intense same-sex friendships, which we will discuss in more detail later on. Then, in the 18th century, sodomy began to be considered as less of an act but more of as a person called a sodomite, so someone who does sodomy. They were stereotyped as feminine, and people used the slur Molly to refer to them. In London in particular, Molly houses began to pop up. In these pubs and coffee houses, gay men would commit sodomy, but also socialise and form communities with each other. It was easier for men to make these communities compared to most women because as men they had more freedom outside of the home. Next, in the 19th century, in 1868 in Germany, Karl Maria Kurtbeny, a gay man, was the first person to use the word homosexual as being an identity and part of someone. He used the word homosexual in a letter he wrote to Karl Heinrich Ulrichs. These two men were considered to be the first people to campaign for social and political equality for homosexuals in Europe. Being gay continued to develop from being thought of as an act to an identity by being considered a disease in the late 19th century, as a result of the rise of medicine labeling gay people as sexual deviants. So, homosexual men began to develop even more queer communities, having been put into a box by society. For example, in London, the secret language of Polari that was a combination of Italian and Romani and was spoken by performers, circus people, travellers and prostitutes began to be spoken by gay men in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They wanted to speak to each other in secret and to form relationships and communities because it was still illegal and socially unacceptable to commit homosexual acts at this time. In the late 20th century, gay history became more intertwined with activism and politics and developed into how we consider it today. This was because from the 1960s onwards, society began to become less rigid with its views on sexuality and gender, and the communities that gay people had previously formed for themselves became organised and more aware of their position in society. Homosexuality was largely legalised in Western Europe from the 1960s to 1980s, and in some Eastern European countries a bit later on in the 1980s and 1990s, because the Soviet Union was very against homosexuality. The word gay also began to become more associated with being LGBTQ+, where previously it was used to mean happy. LGBTQ+ rights groups also began to pop up across Europe in this time, like the Gay Liberation Front in 1973. However, homosexuality remained associated with disease in the late 20th century. It was considered a mental illness by the World Health Organization until 1992, And during the 1980s, the AIDS crisis occurred and particularly affected gay and bisexual men and transgender women. AIDS is a disease that HIV becomes. It is a virus that is contracted through sexual contact and blood, and as LGBTQ+ people have much less access to contraceptives and sex education, AIDS spreads fast in these communities. There is no cure and it has a high death rate. As hundreds and thousands of LGBTQ+ people died of AIDS in the crisis, a large portion of the baby boomer generation of the community is sadly missing. Then, in the 20th century, gay people amongst other LGBTQ+ people have gained rights such as to adopt, marry and serve in the military. However, their history is still not finished, as it is still not accepted by everyone in Europe or the world. Now we have completed the timeline, we understand how being gay has developed in Europe over the centuries to what it is today. Pause the video and have another look over the timeline. What do you notice about the dates and events? What do you notice about how ideas surrounding being gay changed? What do you think life was like for gay men in the past? Discuss these questions using the timeline to help you, write your answers in the worksheet and resume the video when you are ready to continue. Some things that you may have written about the dates and events on the timeline could include how many of them being gay was illegal or thought of as bad for a lot of the past, and that most of the events where it was not seen as negative or criminal are very recent. You may have noticed that it changed from being thought of as an act that someone did, to then a person that did the act, then to a disease, and finally into an identity and part of someone. From this, gay people made communities for themselves and used these to do activism for their rights. Life for gay people in the past may have felt very lonely depending on when and where you were, but for some people, they were able to be themselves in small communities with other gay men in the past. It was easier for them to do this because as men, they had more social freedom, but with this, their sexualities were heavily monitored and criminalized by the law, as they were seen as important in maintaining the patriarchy, as we said earlier. This also meant that for some men in the past, their lives could have been quite dangerous if they chose to express their sexuality. Now that you are familiar with how gay history is developed, let's discuss some examples of prominent gay historical figures. Below, you can see two extracts written by historians about King James VI and First of Scotland and England. He ruled England from 1603 to 1625, but we will talk more about his reign soon. One of these extracts has been written by the historian James Babington Macaulay in the 19th century, and the other by the historian Jenny Wormald in the 20th century. Take a moment to pause the video and read over these extracts. Compare and contrast how historians in the 19th and 20th centuries have considered King James. To help you, think about what is each historian saying about him. How is what they are saying similar? How is what they are saying different? Pause the video to compare the extracts and write down your ideas in the worksheet. When you are ready to continue and look at some ideas, press play. Now that you've had a chance to compare them, let's go over them. In the first extract by Macaulay in the 19th century, we can see that he refers to James in a very negative way, saying he has no control over Parliament and was childish, unappealing and had no manners and a bad accent. In the second extract by Wormald in the 20th century, we can see that she refers to King James in a more positive way, having solved problems in the church and state, and left his kingdom in a much better way than it was left to him by Elizabeth I and ruled over by his son, Charles I. James appears to have a very different reputation amongst historians in the 19th century than in the 20th century. In the 19th century, he was considered in a much more negative way, not achieving much in his reign, but in the 20th century, he was thought of as nearly the opposite. So, why did the reputation of King James change so much during the 20th century? Before we answer this, let's quickly look at his life and what he actually did, so we understand him a bit better first. James I was originally the King of Scotland, but after Elizabeth I died in 1603, he became King of England too, as she left no heir. Because he was Protestant, he was seen as suitable for the throne, so he became the first of the Stuart royal family to be on the English throne. During his reign, he ended the war with Spain in 1604 and maintained peace with them. He was cooperative with Parliament despite their conflicts and him believing in his divine right to rule being given to him by God. He was also nearly blown up by the Catholic Guy Fawkes in the Gunpowder Plot and made peace between Scotland and England as king of both realms. So, as his reign can be seen as pretty stable throughout, why was he considered so negatively by 19th century historians? There are several reasons behind this. Firstly, as he was Scottish, many of his ministers thought that he was unfit for English Parliament. This meant that the evidence from these ministers that Victorian historians were using showed negative ideas about James as king and influenced their conclusions. As well, in the 19th century, historians believe that his reign was responsible for setting up the Civil War, which was a very unstable time for England. So, the blame for this also meant that he had a bad reputation with historians. However, 20th century historians have gone back and re-examined his reign since then, and they have found that actually, he was not to blame for the Civil War. Charles I's reign was, and that he coped well in an English parliament. There is also another reason that James had such a negative reputation that these 20th century historians discovered when they re-examined his reign. They also found evidence to suggest that King James might have been gay, despite being married to Anne of Denmark. James was known for having several favourite men in his court that he appeared to be very close to and would display emotional and physical affection with, like the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, and Robert Carr. For example, in a letter to George Villiers years after his wife had died, James says that he desired only to live in the world for his sake, and he refers to him as his wife. He was also criticised often in court because of the amount of money he spent on clothes as presents for him. These very close, supposed friendships were an example of how in early modern society, homosexual upper-class men were able to express themselves and find other gay people to form relationships with, while still being socially acceptable by being married to women. Him calling Villiers his wife also shows how gay people back then tried to express their attraction within the ideas that they already knew, as the idea of being gay did not exist yet. So, as his relationships with these men were quite known throughout the court, he was described in unflattering ways, like as feminine and weak, by his ministers, because relationships like his were frowned upon in the 17th century. This again impacted his reputation with 19th century historians who were going off of this unflattering evidence. As well, in the 19th century, it was of course still frowned upon to be gay, so this also made historians of this period consider him more negatively and ignore this side of him. But, as being gay was more tolerated in the 20th century, this meant that 20th century historians who re-examined his reign and discovered that he may have been queer viewed his sexuality as something to be studied, not ignored. So, this evidence of James's sexuality became more well-known and accepted, and his reputation more positive. Therefore, King James's legacy can show us how the sexualities of some well-known people in history have been ignored and affected how they are remembered. This is because they seem negative to historians, as being gay was not tolerated when they lived. As well, the negative attitudes of the societies that his historians wrote about him lived in also influenced this. His legacy also shows us that anyone in the past and present can be gay, even kings, and that there is evidence of same-sex love and attraction from the early modern period, despite it not being thought of beyond the act of sodomy. What can you remember about King James VI and first? Quickly pause the video and answer these questions below in your worksheet to see if you can remember what you learned. Resume the video when you're ready for the answers. When did King James rule England? Who did James refer to as his wife? Which countries did James make peace between? Who was James married to? Who nearly blew him up in the gunpowder plot? Now that you've had a go, let's go over the answers. Number 1 was he ruled from 1603 to 1625. Number 2 was George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. Number 3 was he made peace with Spain and Scotland. Number 4 was he was married to Anne of Denmark. And finally, number 5 was he was nearly blown up in the gunpowder plot by Guy Fawkes. So, that is all for our first gay figure in this video. Now let's take a look at another important but quite different figure in gay history. Below, you can see 2 extracts written by historians about a man called Bayard Rustin. He was a prominent figure in the American civil rights movement in the 20th century, but we'll get more into his life soon. For now, let's look at these extracts. The first one was written by Daniel Levine in 2000, and the second one by John D'Amelio in 2006. Take a moment to read each extract about Rustin and try to work out what these historians thought of him and how he is being remembered. To help you, think about things like, what is each historian saying? Is what they are saying similar or different? What can these extracts tell us about Rustin and how he is remembered? Take a moment to pause the video and read the extracts, discuss and write down your ideas in the worksheet, and resume the video when you are ready to continue. Now that you've had a chance to think, let's go over them. In the first extract by Daniel Levine, he says that Rustin was a key figure throughout the civil rights movement for many decades. In the second extract by John D'Amelio, he says that Rustin was very important to the movement as he helped create key organisations. He also asks how we cannot know who he is because of his achievements. Both of these extracts are similar as they speak positively of Rustin and show him to be a very important central figure in the civil rights movement, who is present throughout its course and made some major contributions to its well-known organisations. They both also show that he is seen quite positively by historians for his work. Aside from his achievements, a lot of what is written about him is from the 1990s onwards, when being gay was more tolerated in society, so historians were less likely to write about him negatively because of this. John D'Amelio is also a gay historian. Except D'Amelio questions why more people do not know of him. This suggests that despite his achievements and positive reputation with historians, that he is not as widely remembered or known as other leaders like Martin Luther King. For example, did you know who Bayard Rustin was before this video? Before we get into a bit more detail about why he has not been as widely remembered in history, let's go into some more detail about his life so we can understand him. Bayard Rustin was born in 1912 and lived until 1987. From 1941 to 1953, he became a part of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was a religious organization. As we've already mentioned too, he organized the New York branch of the Congress of Racial Equality in 1941. Rustin also took part in the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, where he met Martin Luther King, and the two developed a friendship and he became King's advisor. He was also a key organizer of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization that Martin Luther King ran. In 1963, he pushed for his fellow civil rights leaders to march on Washington and organize the protest, where Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He was awarded honorary degrees by Yale and the City College of New York for his work as an activist. In 2013, after his death, he was also awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for those who have made a big contribution to the welfare of American society. So after achieving so much in his life, why is he not as remembered despite his massive contributions to civil rights history? First of all, in American society during the 1940s to the 1960s, as the US was enemies with the Soviet Union, anyone who seemed to be un-American or associated with the Soviet Union was seen as a threat to society. Rustin was a communist during the 1930s, and even after he left the Communist Party, the FBI still saw this as a reason to monitor him, as he was seen as dangerous and critical of America. This made it risky for him to have a major role in early organizations and created tension with other leaders, so Rustin sadly fell into the background of the movement. Secondly, he was a pacifist, so someone that is against all forms of violence. Rustin lived through several major American wars and was jailed for refusing to serve in them, like World War II. So this meant that again, he was seen as a threat by the FBI. But the final reason for him not being very well known is because he was gay. In 1953, Rustin was arrested and jailed for 60 days for having sex with men and asked to leave the Fellowship of Reconciliation because of this arrest. He also had a relationship with Walter Nagel from 1977, and they were together for 10 years until he died. He was accepted by his family, but encouraged to hide his sexuality to avoid trouble, so Rustin did not express his sexuality clearly throughout his career, but he never denied being gay either. So even though he was a key civil rights figure, he was pushed to the background and still not remembered within history. This was because when he lived, homosexuality was still illegal and seen as a mental illness, and the Christian communities that he was a part of kept questioning his morals as his sexuality was considered a sin. As a result, Rustin was also not seen as respectable enough to be the face of the movement, because other leaders did not want to risk it not being taken seriously by other civil rights groups in American society because it was associated with gay people. So, as he remained in the background of the movement because of his sexuality and beliefs, this is why he is not as remembered in history. So Rustin's legacy shows us that even if someone has been considered positively by historians and there is lots of evidence of their accomplishments, that the negative attitudes towards being gay when they lived still meant that their accomplishments and reputation were ignored as they were pushed aside for more acceptable people. Because of this, his legacy then also shows how societies and some historians have then remembered him because of his sexuality, with American society, for example, ignoring Rustin and choosing to celebrate Martin Luther King, a more acceptable heterosexual civil rights leader. Finally, his life also shows us how gay black men expressed themselves in 20th century America through meeting in secret with other gay people and having relationships, and Rustin's refusal to deny his sexuality also shows how gay men were becoming more aware of their identities as not being shameful. What can you remember about Bayard Rustin? Quickly pause the video and answer these questions below in your worksheet to see if you can remember what you learned. Resume the video when you're ready for the answers. When was Rustin born? What organization did he found in New York in 1941? When did Rustin begin his relationship with Walter Nagel? What major event in civil rights history did Rustin organize in 1963? What year was he awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom? Now that you've had a go, let's go over the answers. Number 1 was he was born in 1912. Number 2 was he organized the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. Number 3 was his relationship with Walter Nagel began in 1977. Number 4 was he organized the March on Washington. And finally, number 5 was he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Honor in 2013. That is all for our second important gay historical figure. It is also all for the video. Thank you so much for watching and taking part in this video. Let's quickly recap what we have learnt before we go. We explored what the gay identity is, we looked at a brief timeline of how the idea of being gay has changed throughout history, and we studied two important historical figures, King James VI and I of Scotland and England, and Bayard Rustin. We learned that gay people are unique because they are not heterosexual but are men, and the gay community is very large and diverse. We also learned that aspects of gay history, like the sexuality of figures from well-known histories, are often ignored or criticised, meaning that they are not as remembered or seen as negative despite what they achieve. For now though, I will say goodbye. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video for more content, and check out the link in the description for more further reading and resources. Also follow us on social media. You can find our Twitter, Instagram and Facebook pages in the description too. Goodbye and see you in the next video.